Okay, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're really digging into a pivotal moment in history using our source material. Chapter 5 of the Crisis Years, Kennedy and Khrushchev, 1963. The chapter is called I'm Not Going to Risk an American Hungary. And wow, it throws us right into the deep end of U.S.-Cuba-Soviet relations, right on the edge of a massive crisis.
Yeah.
We've got all the details here, and our job is to pull out the key stuff, the history, the people, the decisions, the analysis from the source, so you get a real feel for this time.
Absolutely. This chapter zooms in on Cuba under Castro, how the U.S. response was shifting, where the Soviets stood, and all the pressures on President Kennedy as he basically inherits this secret plan to deal with Castro. We'll trace it all from Cuba's historical ties to the U.S. through the revolution, Castro looking towards Moscow, and the U.S. trying to counter him, right up to those final moments before the invasion was supposed to happen. So to really get the tension here, we need that backstory. Cuba wasn't just some island that popped up on the radar.
Not at all. Our source lays it out pretty clearly. Cuba had been, well, essentially under U.S. influence since 1898, after the Spanish-American War. The U.S. occupied it, slapped on the Platt Amendment.
Which basically said the U.S. could step in whenever they felt like it, right?
Yeah.
To preserve independence.
Exactly, which in reality meant preserving U.S. control. It set a pattern.
And the leaders who came up in that system, the source describes a lot of corruption, violence.
Oh, definitely. And Fulgencio Batista is kind of the poster child for that. Started as an army sergeant, pulls off a coup in '33, controls things from the shadows, makes a fortune. Then he even becomes president in 1940, lines up with the Allies in World War II, takes a break, then bam, another coup in '52, bloodless this time, and he's back in charge.
And the U.S. economic footprint was just enormous by then.
Huge. The source gives numbers. Americans owning 40% of sugar, 80% of utilities, 90% of mining. So yeah, Cuba might have looked okay on paper, per capita income, education stats, but the wealth was massively concentrated. It mostly bypassed people outside the cities, non-white Cubans. And the sugar industry, the main engine, was sputtering, causing unemployment, fueling anger at Batista.
And Batista's response to dissent was just brutal. The source mentions those awful images, bodies of Castro supporters hanging from trees. That kind of thing really sets the stage.
It does. And the source also drops in that reminder about the CIA's history in the region, helping push out the leftist government in Guatemala in '54 because it threatened the United Fruit Company.
And United Fruit had big interests in Cuba too, right?
A very strong presence, so that context is definitely there.
Okay, so enter Fidel Castro. The source gets some interesting background on him. He wasn't exactly working class.
No, not at all. His father was a Spanish immigrant who actually did well, became a landowner. He even rented land from the United Fruit Company, interestingly enough. But Fidel, the source says, felt the shame of living in this U.S.-dominated pseudo-republic.
He was inspired by José Martí, the big figure of Cuban independence. And as a young man, the source calls him excitable, devious, defiant, tried to organize his father's workers, set fire to the family fields.
Yeah, quite the character. Elite schools, then the University of Havana, which was a real hotbed. He joins an anti-imperialist group, speaks out, starts carrying a gun after a warning from the secret police.
And his early activism included going after Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. The source mentions Trujillo extorted money from Batista, maybe to use against Castro.
That's in there, yeah. About $3 million. Shows the tangled web. Castro gets married, visits the U.S., buys books by Marx and Engels, planned a political career until Batista's coup canceled the elections.
Which leads directly to the Moncada barracks attack in '53.
Right. The attack itself failed spectacularly, but his defense speech, that 2-hour epic citing Martí, becomes the revolution's touchstone. History will absolve me.
And he wasn't just talking politics. He laid out a whole program. Land reform, profit sharing, housing, speaking for the jobless.
Absolutely.
Right.
After prison, he heads to Mexico, plans the guerrilla landing. The Grandma trip in '56 was nearly a wipeout. Only 16 survive.
And here's that wild detail. The source says the CIA was rumored to have slipped his movement 50 grand, hedging their bets.
That's what the source mentions, yeah. A strange little footnote. But the real crystallizing moment for Castro's anti-Americanism, according to the source, came later.
After Batista used American bombers and napalm against his forces.
Exactly. He writes to his mistress, vowing this war against Batista is just the beginning. A much greater war against the Americans would come later. That's a chilling line.
So by 1958, things are really shifting Castro's way.
Definitely. Even businessmen and landowners, just sick of Batista, were pouring money into his 26th of July movement. The British ambassador had a good take. noted in the source. Castro seen as this romantic hero, Robin Hood type, but also whispers about communist sympathies.
And Washington, Eisenhower, and Nixon, they're getting worried. Batista's clearly going down.
Yeah, you see figures like Arthur Gardner, a Republican financier, sending urgent messages to Nixon late in '58, trying to salvage things. Nixon himself had this long-standing interest in Cuba, friends in Miami like Bebe Raposo.
Eisenhower even sends William Pauly, right? Former ambassador, big Cuban interests, CIA ties.
Used frequently by Ike as a private channel, the source says. Sent Pauly to ask Batista to step down for someone responsible, but it was just too late.
New Year's Day, 1959. Batista flees. Castro gives that speech, echoing Moncada, saying the real revolution starts now. A free Cuba, not like 1898 when the Americans took over.
And the reception in Havana is overwhelming. Horns honking, casinos ransacked, people shouting, "Gracias, Fidel," total adulation.
Okay, Castro's in power, operating out of the Havana Hilton, initially trying not to provoke the U.S. too much.
That's the picture the source paints initially, but things changed fast. When the U.S. complained about the trials and executions of Batista's guys, these war criminals,
Castro basically dares them to invade. Land the Marines, face 200,000 gringos dead.
pretty bold. Then he visits Washington in April '59, promises a free press, says he won't grab American property, but Eisenhower snubs him, makes sure he's out of town.
So he meets Nixon and Secretary of State Herter instead. Herter's impression is fascinating, like a child. Immature, speaks okay in English, but gets wild in Spanish.
Yeah, that's Herter's take reported in the source. Even McGeorge Bundy, later JFK's national security guy, met him at Harvard. Bundy found him hard to connect with personally, but it didn't immediately set off alarm bells for Bundy, like this guy has to go immediately.
Interesting. Castro knew playing the communist card too early would backfire with the U.S.
Right. His brother Raul and Che Guevara were committed Marxists, but Fidel held back publicly. The source states he was quietly working with old-school Cuban communists since '58, though.
And the Soviets. They weren't exactly focused on Latin America before this.
No, they generally respected the Monroe Doctrine. And in '59, after Camp David, Khrushchev was trying to smooth things over with Eisenhower. He was wary of jumping in bed with this erratic young rebel and messing that up.
But Castro needed someone powerful. History showed the U.S. wouldn't just let a hostile government sit 90 miles away. Eisenhower was already blocking arms sales.
Castro must have figured he couldn't stand up to the U.S. alone forever. He needed a counterweight.
So how did the Soviet connection actually happen? Did they reach out first?
The source says yes, a secret feeler. In October '59, Alexander Alexiev shows up in Havana. Officially TS correspondent, actually KGB.
Finds Castro is incredibly popular, reports back Soviet admiration.
Which gets Castro interested in trade. There was some skepticism in Moscow. Khrushchev's son-in-law saw Castro as just another dictator. But Mikoyan, the deputy premier, visits in February '60 and they sign a trade deal.
Then comes the Le Coubry incident. The French ship exploding in Havana Harbor, March 1960.
Huge turning point. Alexiev, the Soviet agent, believed it was a CIA bomb. And according to Alexiev in the source, it was only after this that Castro formally asked for Soviet military help.
Then the oil companies refused to refine Soviet crude.
Esso, Texaco, Shell. Castro seizes the refineries. Alexiev notes Castro got the Soviet oil way cheaper anyway.
Eisenhower had privately threatened war back in '59 if the Soviets took Cuba. Now his public response comes in July '60.
He cuts off the Cuban sugar quota, a massive blow. Alexiev called it death to the Cuban Revolution. Castro asks the Soviets to buy just a symbolic amount to help out.
And Khrushchev goes all in. Sends a cable, we'll buy it all. 700,000 tons that year and the next.
Huge moment. The source describes this rally of 1 million people just erupting in joy. Castro feels empowered, declares the embargo will cost Americans down to the nails in their shoes.
And then he nationalizes $850 million in U.S. assets, despite those earlier promises.
Exactly. That's when you see the big exodus of disillusioned Cubans heading for the U.S. Eisenhower privately is talking about blockades, intervention if U.S. citizens are harmed.
By summer 1960, any hope of U.S.-Soviet détente is basically gone. Cuba is now a strategic piece for Moscow.
Right in America's backyard. A chance to show communist solidarity. Llewellyn Thompson's quote in the source is telling Soviets saw it like their own revolutionary movement all over again.
So sugar goes out, Soviet credits and weapons come in.
And Khrushchev makes that dramatic declaration in July '60. Monroe Doctrine is dead, threatens rocket fire symbolic. His aides later clarified, but still.
Che Guevara boasts about being defended by the greatest military power. Eisenhower warns against a communist-dominated regime.
And then that very public embrace in Harlem during the UN trip in the fall, Khrushchev hugging Castro at the Hotel Teresa. No mistaking the alignment now.
Okay, let's bring Kennedy into this more directly. His personal history with Cuba is interesting. The source mentions trips before he was president.
Yeah, December 57, early 58. Unpublicized trips with Senator George Smathers.
Not exactly state visits. The source calls them bachelor's holidays.
Yeah.
Golf, sailing, hitting the clubs, Tropicana, Casino Parisian.
There's even that detail about Meyer Lansky's widow claiming her husband gave Kennedy tips on women. Smathers said Kennedy just liked Cuba. The vibe, the people, the money.
And this is while Batista's cracking down brutally. But Kennedy didn't seem to have strong opinions either way then.
According to Smathers in the source, no. Not about Batista, not about Castro. Just going, frankly, for a vacation. And remember, Kennedy also knew Florence Pritchett well, who was married to Earl Smith, the ambassador then.
The source makes a good point. Batista's security probably kept files on important American visitors. Kennedy's a rising star.
So Castro might have had access to those files later, maybe informing his dismissive comment about Kennedy being a rich illiterate. It's plausible based on the source.
The source also offers that insight about Kennedy's personality. Cool, rational, maybe lacking that gut understanding of fiery revolutionaries like Castro.
He relied on informal advisors like Smathers and Earl Smith, the former ambassador, who was fiercely anti-Castro and lobbied Kennedy constantly. Smathers thought Kennedy was too focused on Europe, needed more push on Cuba.
Early on, though, Kennedy's book, The Strategy of Peace, sounded a bit different. Seeing Castro and Bolívar's legacy, wondering if a warmer welcome might have helped.
Yeah, he seemed to regret, privately, not reaching out more in '59. But by the fall of 1960, with Castro becoming more openly anti-American, Kennedy shifts hard right publicly.
Talking about getting rid of Castro and Hoffa, complaining about fatigues, calling Cuba a communist satellite, criticizing Eisenhower.
And then the call to help the exile freedom fighters. Dean Rusk later said Kennedy's anti-Castro feeling was intense, not just politics, but emotional.
What was driving that campaign intensity? Was he worried Eisenhower might pull an October surprise?
The source suggests that was a factor, yeah. Fear Ike might launch something pre-election to help Nixon. And Nixon was pushing behind the scenes, complaining the CIA wasn't moving fast enough.
And the covert planning itself started way earlier than most people think.
Much earlier. March 1959, the source states. Before the big nationalizations, before the Soviet alignment was clear, Eisenhower's National Security Council was already talking about bringing another government to power.
By January 60, they're talking specifics. Using the Cuban underground, training exiles in Panama like the Guatemala playbook.
Allen Dulles shows Ike a plan to hit a sugar refinery, and Eisenhower's like, don't just fool around with sugar refineries. He wanted something decisive.
Which leads to Dulles's March 1960 program of covert action. Government in exile, propaganda, sabotage paramilitary force.
Dulles hoped for a quick coup before the election. When it didn't happen, Nixon got suspicious. The source says he thought CIA liberals deliberately slow-walked it to help Kennedy, just like he felt they handed Kennedy the missile gap issue.
So Kennedy wins. November 18, 1960, Dulles and Bissell head down to Palm Beach to brief the president-elect. Dulles felt awkward with Kennedy.
The source mentions that, yeah, maybe a generational thing. And here's a really intriguing bit. The source suggests Dulles might have used a CIA personality profile on Kennedy.
Compiled from old files. British surveillance of his dad, his own wartime service, to predict how he'd react.
Possibly. And then there's the other layer the source brings up, the FBI and CIA files on Kennedy's affair back in '42 with Inga Arvad, the suspected Nazi spy. Hoover had listened in.
And his father, Joe Kennedy, knew about this and spent years cultivating Hoover and Dulles, which influenced JFK keeping them on.
The source doesn't say it was the main reason, but argues this potential blackmail material made Kennedy less free to just overrule Hoover or Dulles on things than he might have been otherwise. It's a complex factor.
So Bissell lays out the Cuba plan in Joe Kennedy's house. Maps, charts. JFK seemed surprised mostly by the scale.
Dulles and Bissell hammer the urgency. Soviet aid is pouring in, Castro's getting stronger, delay is dangerous, Kennedy wants time. Dulles says there isn't much time. Talk about pressure.
By January 61, right before the inauguration, the urgency is dialed way up.
Definitely. Dulles is telling senators privately, Cuba's essentially gone communist, becoming a real military power. Soviet arms, Czech pilots for MiGs coming, totalitarian controls tightening.
And Castro's exporting revolution, Panama, Nicaragua, DR, Haiti. The CIA is worried about dominoes falling.
But the big fear, the really chilling one mentioned in the source, Cuba becoming a Soviet missile base.
A direct threat, and making it much harder to negotiate them out later.
So Eisenhower, on his way out, tells Kennedy the CIA plan is looking good, and basically, it's your job to make it work. Heavy handover.
Dulles tells the new NSC late January. Cuba's communist, military power growing, opposition also growing, need a decision on the Guatemala trainees soon.
This race against time leads the CIA to pivot. Forget small infiltrations. Let's plan a real military operation. Beachhead, B-26 air cover to smash transport and communications, propaganda, stir up dissent.
And the target by February is Trinidad, near mountains for retreat, supposedly anti-Castro area.
Okay, so inside the administration, you've got differing views. Bundy reports in early February. Defense and CIA, gung-ho. If it works, great. If it fails, they retreat to the mountains, start a civil war.
But State Department, much more cautious, worried about the global political fallout, UN, Latin America.
And Kennedy himself is torn. He wants Castro gone, sure. But he's also pushing things like the Alliance for Progress, trying to align the U.S. with new nations.
An open invasion looks like old-school imperialism. He fears it becoming another Hungary, tanks crushing people, bad optics, terrible reality.
But the source highlights an even bigger strategic fear driving Kennedy.
Berlin. Right. A big U.S. move in Cuba, where they have the advantage, might push Khrushchev to retaliate in Berlin, where the Soviets have the advantage.
And the West is committed to Berlin. If Khrushchev makes a move there, Kennedy faces an impossible choice. Back down and look weak, maybe collapse NATO, or risk nuclear war.
And he kept this Berlin fear mostly to himself, worried about leaks making him look hesitant or paralyzed.
That's what the source suggests. So because of all this, he pushes back on the CIA. Find a quieter way, a landing where they can fight from the mountains, not look like a Yankee invasion force.
March 11, he says no to the Trinidad plan. Too spectacular, too much like a big conventional invasion.
Dulles argues back. What do we do with the exiles in Guatemala? The disposal problem. If we disarm them, they might resist, spill the beans, cause chaos in Latin America. Huge backlash from the right wing against Kennedy.
So the CIA comes back with Plan Zapata, March 15, landing at the Bay of Pigs, west of Trinidad.
Bundy praises it as unspectacular and quiet and plausibly Cuban. Kennedy wants it even quieter, unload at night.
And here's that massive oversight the source points out. Nobody, not Kennedy, Bundy, McNamara, seems to clock the Bay of Pigs doesn't have mountains nearby.
Right. No escape route if things go wrong. They're landing in a swamp. It's incredible.
Kennedy heads to Palm Beach for Easter, still undecided. Fulbright gives him that memo arguing against it. Hypocrisy, another Hungary. Better to just tolerate Castro.
Meanwhile, Kennedy's golfing with his dad and Bing Crosby, seeing Earl Smith swimming. Security's tight because of kidnapping rumors about Caroline.
And the source highlights Beschloss's view. Kennedy comes back from Palm Beach more militant. Schlesinger noticed he seemed skeptical before the trip, but Bundy found him ready to go ahead after, without more debate.
Who influenced him? Bundy suspected Palm Beach contact Smathers, his father, Earl Smith, pushing. Schlesinger also suspected his father.
Joe Kennedy was all for it, talking to JFK multiple times a day. The source notes his views were pretty extreme, way outside the mainstream. Bundy wasn't impressed by the elder Kennedy's influence attempt.
So Kennedy gets back April 4th. Secret meeting, supposedly on Laos, but really about Zapata. Rusk, McNamara, Bissell, Joint Chiefs, Fulbright's there too.
McNamara's keen. Rusk is worried about international law, especially if the U.S. military isn't directly involved. He stays quiet in the meeting, plays his cards close, wants to advise privately.
Kennedy's still uneasy about how noisy it is, but feels committed now. Can't just take the guns away from the brigade. Schlesinger sees him as more militant since Florida.
And the press leaks are adding pressure. Reports about training camps surfaced way back in October 60.
Early April, the New Republic is about to run a piece. Schlesinger gets wind of it, asks the editor to kill it on highest authority, presumably Kennedy. The editor complies.
Then April 7, the New York Times has a big story by Tad Zulk detailing the CIA training for an imminent invasion. Kennedy personally calls it the publisher Dreyfus, gets him to tone it down significantly.
Kennedy's exasperated reaction, noted in the source, Castro doesn't need agents. All he has to do is read our papers. Dreyfus, later Fred of the Times, would be blamed if it all went wrong.
Okay, switch perspectives. What's Khrushchev thinking? Is he expecting this?
The source suggests he was skeptical of the intelligence reports, thought they might be American disinformation. His son, Sergei, said he didn't think Cuba could really resist a landing.
He figured the U.S. would probably do something eventually. Saw Cuba as vulnerable, like a sausage.
He'd made those missile threats back in '60, then kind of walked them back. Early '61, he denies having bases in Cuba, hopes the U.S. has common sense. He lets Mikoyan shout anti-Yankee slogans, but stays cautious himself with the new president coming in.
His big Wars of Liberation speech in January mentions solidarity with Cuba, but doesn't promise much concrete. He seemed less engaged on Cuba with Ambassador Thompson.
A Soviet diplomat, Kornienko, meets Schlesinger in early April, trying to feel out U.S. intentions, maybe dangle talks, but mostly gauge force levels. Admits Castro won't even talk to them about internal communist control.
Then, April 11, Walter Lippmann meets Khrushchev at his Black Sea place. Khrushchev seems resigned, like great powers just naturally mess with unfriendly neighbors. He flatly tells Lippmann the U.S. is prepping a landing and the Soviets will oppose it.
Lippmann hoped oppose just meant words, not actions. But this meeting happens just as the Soviets achieve something huge.
The first man in space, Yuri Gagarin.
Massive propaganda coup. Khrushchev loved using space feats to distract from military weaknesses and impress the world, especially developing nations. He timed them carefully, like the moonshot before his U.S. trip.
McNamara's talk about U.S. missile superiority might have pushed Khrushchev to rush the manned flight. The source includes that tragic detail about the cosmonaut Bondarenko dying in a fire.
Yes, Valentin Bondarenko died March 23, 1961 in an oxygen-rich pressure chamber fire. Hot plate, alcohol-soaked cotton. Khrushchev ordered a total cover-up, airbrushed him out of photos.
And the source connects that secrecy to the later Apollo 1 fire, saying knowledge of the Soviet accident might have saved American lives.
A sobering thought. So April 12th, Gagarin, who saw Bondarenko die, makes the flight. Vostok, the East, announced only after success. Communism triumphant. Khrushchev gives him a bear hug, huge celebrations. Gagarin statues everywhere, none for Bondarenko.
Khrushchev boasts, it proves Soviet superiority across the board, even though it was mainly achieved by pouring resources into space. But globally, many people bought it.
Kennedy puts out a prepared statement, praises the tech feat, tries to downplay it at a press conference, dictator's advantage, etc. But the mood in the U.S., as the source notes, was frustration, shame, even fury.
Privately, Kennedy knew the USSR had huge problems, housing, agriculture, but the pressure from losing the space race was immense. It shifted his thinking from the campaign focus on catching up.
The source strongly suggests this pressure for some kind of American win somewhere significantly boosted the momentum for the Cuba operation.
So pressure's on. Sorensen says Kennedy's committed now, annoyed by doubters, saying everybody's grabbing their nuts on this. April 12, Gagarin's flight day, someone suggests U.S. forces might need to step in if the invasion succeeds initially.
And Kennedy just explodes, according to the source. Under no circumstances, I'm not going to risk an American Hungary, calls it a potential fucking slaughter.
Later that day, he publicly states, no U.S. armed forces intervention under any conditions. Crystal clear.
The final go-no-go is due Friday, April 14. Kennedy reads this telegram from a Marine colonel who checked out the exile brigade, says they're itching to fight, but crucially, do not expect help from the U.S. armed forces.
That seems to seal it. Kennedy greenlights the preliminary airstrikes for Saturday, but insists Bissell keep the number minimal, cutting it down from 16 planes.
Saturday morning, April 15th. 6 B-26s, painted with Cuban markings, hit 3 airfields. They damaged some planes, but less than half of Castro's Air Force. Then the decoy pilot lands in Miami, claims defection. Castro blames the U.S. at the UN.
And Adlai Stevenson, U.S. ambassador to the UN, is completely blindsided. He wasn't told about the decoy.
Nope. So he goes out and defends the fake story as requested. When he finds out it was a lie, he's livid, feels deliberately tricked. Thinks about resigning, but stays, feeling the country's in enough trouble. He's disgusted, calls it the Cuban absurdity, complains about boy commandos.
Stevenson's main worry, noted in the source, is the damage to U.S. credibility if the deception is exposed. He cables Rusk. If Cuba proves these planes weren't defectors, we're in deep trouble internationally.
Rusk and Bundy panic. They fear Stevenson quitting, another U-2-type disaster. They call Kennedy on Sunday, April 16th. He's at Glenora, his Virginia place, which the source says he didn't like much.
Kennedy takes the call, hears about the UN mess. His reaction is stark. I'm not signed on to this. He cancels the second wave of crucial airstrikes planned for just before the landing.
Orders they can only happen after the exiles have secured the beachhead so they can pretend the planes flew from captured Cuban soil. Jacqueline sees him pacing, more distressed than she'd ever seen him.
Bundy tells Bissell. Bissell and General Campbell, Dulles' deputy, are frantic. They argue with Rusk Sunday night. Without that second strike, Castro's planes will sink the invasion ships. Rusk cites politics, Stevenson. Tells him to call Kennedy directly.
They don't. The source speculates maybe they feared Kennedy would cancel the whole thing.
Kennedy later regretted canceling that second strike, though didn't think it was the only mistake. He told a friend maybe if he hadn't been stuck at Glenora that Sunday, things might have been different.
Monday morning, April 17th, 4:30 a.m., Cabell tries again, wakes Rusk with a new idea, let the ships pull back, get air cover from the USS Essex nearby. Rusk says no, that violates the president's order.
Rusk sets up a call. Cabell wakes Kennedy at Glenora, makes the plea for U.S. air cover. Kennedy turns him down flat.
So the invasion goes ahead, pitch black, Bay of Pigs. The ships hit reefs, floodlights hit them from shore, only machine guns for defense. And the source points out the irony. Some boats were from the United Fruit Company, whose presence helped fuel Castro's anger in the first place. Castro's planes start hitting the ships.
And April 17th, it's Khrushchev's 67th birthday. He's back at his Black Sea retreat. Here's Radio Moscow. An armed intervention against Cuba has begun.
His son calls it his present from the United States. The source says Khrushchev was upset, and despite all his talk, he genuinely didn't think Cuba could hold off the invaders.
Wow. We've really unpacked a lot there. From Cuba's deep past, Castro's revolution, the Soviet angle, Eisenhower's initial plans, and then this incredibly complex situation Kennedy inherits. We see his personal history with Cuba, the conflicting advice, the immense political pressures, and those absolutely critical last-minute decisions leading right up to the invasion hitting the beaches.
And this deep dive into the source material really underscores Beschloss's analysis of the layers influencing Kennedy. That fear of an American Hungary, yes, but also that overriding strategic fear about Berlin. The pressure from people close to him, his father, Smathers, Earl Smith, plus the constraints from his own past, the power Hoover and Dulles still held, and then the public pressure cooker fueled by leaks and Soviet wins like Gagarin. It all swirled together.
Yeah, it wasn't just one thing. It was history, personality, strategy, politics, all colliding in this incredibly tight, high-stakes time frame.
What's so striking, reading the source material closely, is how it reveals the chaos that can happen when secret plans meet messy reality, and just how much the personal histories and relationships of leaders can weigh on decisions that affect the entire world.
We've definitely gone deep into the details provided in this chapter. Hopefully, this exploration of the source has given you, our listeners, a much richer understanding of this absolutely pivotal moment.
And maybe something to think about. How often do the hidden currents, the personal secrets, the powerful advisors, the unspoken fears truly steer the ship of state during a crisis?
So, to confirm, we have now covered the key events, the political strategies, the diplomatic back and forth, the crises, the historical context, and the analysis offered by Beschloss, as presented in Chapter 5 of the Crisis Years. Kennedy and Khrushchev, 1960-1963. We've included the main figures, the dates, and the implications laid out in our source material.
Yes, I think we have. Our outline has guided us through the narrative provided in the source, taking us right from Cuba's history up to the very morning the invasion began.